The United States was under an economic depression during the early 1930s, affecting major cities such as Seattle and San Francisco. The wrath of the Depression generated an insignificant amount of unemployment and unfair working conditions. In the summer of 1934, the city of San Francisco developed a general strike. The strike-paralyzed city was described as deserted, with many vehicles ceasing to run and many citizens remaining indoors. Though these strikes happened in other U.S. cities, stretching from Seattle all the way to Chicago to parts of Alaska. Influenced by the effects of the Great Depression, many shops and restaurants closed due to the downfall of the economy, creating dissatisfaction amongst the workers. That discontent brewed for several months, and specifically with the longshoremen. Then they formed labor unions. The workers who participated in the San Francisco General Strike of 1934 broke the barriers of unionizing labor forces, the emotional feelings of the strikers, and the demands of rights from the successful strike. The rise of the unions, a fight against injustice, breaking the barriers in the 1934 San Francisco General Strike. The Great Depression was a distinguishable factor on how the General Strike happened, which caused a severe economic catastrophe. Workers were losing their jobs or forced to work in appalling conditions with low wages. Each morning, workers lined up at the docks hoping to be employed for that day. People had to suck up or bribe the foreman and had to work until exhaustion or they would not be hired again. Although the first conflict happened in October 1933, where 400 longshoremen struck against the Matson Navigation Company, the company refused to recognize the ILA, or the International Longshoremen Association. From these problems, the formation of unions was prevalent. With the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 by the U.S. Congress, it provided great cooperation with unions enacting the longshoremen to organize. Another factor that is important to mention is the revival of the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. It was brought back in the 1920s and it assisted workers to obtain better working conditions and wages. Affiliated with the AFL was the International Longshoremen Association, issuing demands such as recognition, wage increase, and fair work hours. Without the AFL, strikers would have a difficult time planning and executing their strikes. An individual who led the creation of these labor unions was Harry Bridges. Bridges was born in Australia and came to San Francisco. He was always interested to see the place. He took the opportunity to travel from New Zealand to San Francisco.
He eventually settled down in San Francisco in 1922 and started working as a longshoreman. And by 1933, he and a group of others had formed a group within the brand new Longshoremen's Union to argue for a more militant approach.
The government was at first oblivious to these strikes, as President Roosevelt was on vacation during this time period. This moment led to labor unions having the chance to grow and gain support from the citizens, sparking more passion within the workers to demand for reform to improve working conditions. Before the general strike, when President Roosevelt returned, he and other government officials were not able to prevent or put a stop to the prior protests. On July 5, 1934, a violent and surprising event shook San Francisco. This event is known as Bloody Thursday. Police brutality came into play, killing and injuring many strikers. At the end of the day, it left 70 strikers injured and the death of 2 men.
And the police used really very strong tactics. They didn't limit themselves to clubs and tear gas, which they had been using all through the strike up to that point, but they were also using guns loaded with live ammunition, and especially what were called riot guns.
At this event, Nick Sperry and Howard Bordeaux were killed.
And the National Guard came in that night and the next morning with tanks and machine guns and snipers on top of the docks, machine guns set up in front of the docks, tanks patrolling up and down the Embarcadero. And the San Francisco Labor Council members, leaders, and members were absolutely outraged by all of this.
These deaths caused anger and outrage within the strikers, however, brought in support for the strike. On July 9, 1934, a funeral march took place in Market Street. The ambiance was serious and melancholy. Everyone was silent, staying aware of their surroundings with fear.
What was absolutely remarkable about it was very solemn. It was furious but solemn and very sad at the same time. And we wanted people to know that they had performed a major a major act, a desecration, in firing upon workers.
The funeral march created more tension to the already existing strike, making people more furious and fired up. All the sadness and violence from these events established a desire to protect against the opposition, breaking the barriers of the militant force of the police and strikebreakers. For the next 2 weeks, California's governor mobilized the National Guard. On July 16th, unions in San Francisco commenced a general strike that involved 130,000 workers, shutting down the city. The resilience of these strikers proved to be tough. They did not stop protesting until their demands were met or if the change had occurred. Even after the media prolonged the violence of accusing workers having ties with the Communist Party. Alongside, citizens thought of the riot as an attack on the government. This led to the reign of terror where armed men busted in suspected homes, clubbed people, and smashed furniture and equipment. These tough-skinned strikers demonstrated barrier-breaking rights of unifying labor unions. Finally, on July 30th, the ILA membership agreed to end the general strike, granting a collective bargaining agreement. The general strike of 1934 significantly affected the city of San Francisco economically. Waterboarding commerce was important in the ports, as San Francisco was a major port city. Businesses were suffering and struggling because of the strike. Everyday deliveries were popular back then, but could not be made as workers were unionized. Grocery stores could not be stocked as workers were unified. There were no employees available.
It seriously inconvenienced most San Franciscans, and it absolutely terrified a few San Franciscans, especially those wealthy businessmen and politicians who managed to convince themselves that this was the beginning of a communist revolution.
Finally, with all the generated violence and economic crisis, the local and federal government had acted and took action. Edward Vandeleur was the president of the Labor Council and directorate of the strike. He proposed a letter that met with most of the ILA demands, granting protection of consumers, the protection of rights in labor, and the right to organize into trade unions. The longshoremen and other seamen also broke the barriers with their gain of rights from the general strike.
He either desires or will tolerate any attempt to destroy union labor or invade its rights.
These workers had access to union recognition and had a coast-wide agreement that included a 12% wage increase, job security, and equal share of work. Longshoremen had also gained workers' compensation, breaking the barriers of more fair working conditions. They get to be paid even if they are injured or sick. There was also the presence of hiring halls that were established, getting rid of begging to employers. Workers did not have to worry about waiting in line and bribing bosses for a job. After the general strike had been resolved, the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, was passed during the Roosevelt administration. This would influence and change the course of unionizing and striking in the future. The Wagner Act protects workers' and unions' rights, and without this act, the U.S. would not be able to form unions, and even if they did, there would be a massive amount of violence that would have to be involved. The active participation of the longshoremen in the general strike demonstrated that typical people have the unrelenting power and sturdiness if one pushes limits too far. Thus, pushing the barriers of unification through labor unions, emotional feelings of strikers, and the demands of workers' individual rights. Without the revival and the establishment of the AFL and the ILA, longshoremen and other maritime workers would have a strenuous time to organize labor unions. Most importantly, the honorable and outstanding leadership of Harry Bridges, guiding strikers on what specifically they were fighting for and why. Through Harry Bridges, workers showed their utterly strength and power and were resilient until their demands were met or when they were satisfied. Even after the prolonged media calling the strikers having ties with the Communist Party and the brutal strikes that caused numerous deaths and injuries. Finally, on July 30th, 1934, the general strike ended in San Francisco. The longshoremen and other workers were now completely satisfied with their new demands. Furthermore, the passing of the Wagner Act provided the recognition needed for labor unions in the U.S. In the contemporary era, important labor unions such as the International Longshore and Warehouse Union and American Federation of Teachers are necessary. Without these unions, there would be no representation among the longshoremen, and that public education, services, and healthcare to students would not be provided.